Hello and welcome to another episode of the I Actually Read the Book podcast. I'm your host, Spencer Regal, and today we'll be doing a book I've been very excited to do on the show ever since I started the show, and that would be Jonah Goldberg's magnificent new book, Suicide of the West: How the Rebirth of Tribalism, Populism, Nationalism, and Identity Politics is Destroying American Democracy. Now, we're fortunate enough to have, I am fortunate enough to have an autographed copy of this book. Jonah Goldberg came to Dallas about a month and a half ago, and I took the opportunity to have him sign this book, and it's just fantastic. It's one of the couple books in my collection that I have actually autographed. The other would be that I brought on the show is Andrew Klavan's memoir, The Great Good Thing, and I do have Richard Epstein's autograph, but it's not in my copy of the Classical Liberal Constitution. It's in a little digest from the Hoover Institution, because I didn't have the book at the time, unfortunately. So, we have a lot to talk about tonight. I just finished this book tonight, and I have to say, I think it would be hard to top this book for the title of the best book of the year. I would be hard-pressed to think of a book that I've read even in the past, a recent book, that is, excuse me, a book that's come out in the past couple of years, aside from Andrew Klavan's memoir, that has reached such levels of depth and of profundity. Although this is much different from Andrew Klavan's memoir, even though both of them do touch on things that are very deep. They touch on the deepest aspects of human nature. Andrew Klavan's memoir is, of course, focused on himself and his life, whereas Suicide of the West takes as its subject nothing less ambitious than the entire history of Western. Well, yes, you could say the entire history of Western thought of even humanity, of the history of humanity itself, but focusing more intently on the last since 1700, since the Industrial Revolution, since what he calls the miracle took place, and we'll get into that and how he explains that. So Jonah Goldberg, I'm interested to say, Jonah Goldberg was not actually high on my list of favorite authors when I began reading this book, or when I first ordered it. I became interested in it because I saw that he was coming to town, and I thought, oh, well, I know Jonah Goldberg, but I haven't really read any of his books yet. I had been turned off by the cover of his best-selling book, Liberal Fascism, which came out about 15 or so years ago, because it has a Hitler mustache. It has a smiley face that looks like it could be on a Walmart advertisement, and except it has a Hitler mustache on it, which is a pretty funny cover. When I first saw it, I thought it was too provocative. Now, let me get into something for how I'd like to take this show. Let me talk a bit about how I want it to relate to politics. I would like the show to be a bit of a respite from politics. However, you might notice that I tend to review books that are more of a conservative libertarian bent, and that's because those are my personal politics, just getting there right out. To be completely frank, I'm not interested in a lot of I've looked at some of the contemporary, some of the most prominent people in the contemporary left-leaning scene in terms of literature and philosophy, and I just find them completely empty, boring, cliched. People like Ta-Nehisi Coates and pretty much every contemporary fiction writer, is at least the ones that were assigned to me in high school, the ones I had to read, like Viet Thanh Nguyen's The Sympathizer, I thought was just a terrible, meaningless, stupid, sordid, pretentious book that had nothing new to bring to the table, in spite of Oprah's endorsement saying, oh, it brings us a completely new perspective. Yeah, because we've never had an anti-American Vietnam book, anti-American perspective on Vietnam before. Viewing American perspective, the American intervention in Vietnam as being muddle-headed and imperialistic. Yeah, we've never heard that perspective at all before, Oprah. Yeah, let me just tell you that Oprah's book club, perhaps maybe not overtly in my mind, but it's one of those things that made me think of making this podcast. I actually read the book. I have my doubts that Oprah has actually read a single page out of any of the books that she recommends in her stupid book club. Someone like her, it would be it's difficult to imagine her sitting and pondering over the meaning of some obscure Tolstoyan sentence in Anna Karenina, which she has recommended in her book club. I really doubt that she sat there and pondered over the deepest recesses of meaning and significance in that book. But anyway, the reason I bring this up is that I do want to make this podcast largely, if not apolitical, then largely irrelevant to politics, or at least to stand above. I would like to discuss themes that more or less transcend the daily grind of politics and the news cycle. I'd like this to be a place of elevated discourse where we can talk about the higher values and the higher principles that come to play in politics, but not necessarily always focusing on the nitty-gritty of politics. And so I think this book is one of the ones that will be more political, more overtly relevant to the, more directly relevant to our current political scene. And as it happens, we'll have a little discussion of Mr. Goldberg's view of our president, of Donald Trump. And he has a perspective on Donald Trump which I find to be very I find it to be cogent. I find it to be, he is very critical of Donald Trump. He is not accommodating at all to Donald Trump's obvious personal flaws and the hypocrisy of several people, the blindness that several people on the right have to his personal flaws, their willingness to overlook them to overlook them so that they can celebrate all his copious achievements, even which Goldberg is willing to admit that Trump is doing, that Trump is getting some significant, some substantive policy victories in office, but he's not willing to concede that necessarily it was the best decision for the Republican Party, for the conservative movement as a whole, to adopt him as their spokesperson, as their brand, or to adopt the Trump brand, to make him such an integral part of the modern conservative brand. And so we'll get to his to an excerpt about Trump. Now, as you might have been able to tell, I have a lot of excerpts marked out which I thought were interesting. And Jonah Goldberg, as I found out as soon as I began reading this book, is an incredible author. An incredible writer. His style, he doesn't dumb things down. That's something that's you're coming to Jonah Goldberg, you will get a mature, intellectual, informed discussion of contemporary issues and and in this case of history, of pop culture, of politics. And even though it is not dumbed down, he conveys sometimes complicated concepts with ease, with an elevated vocabulary, not a vocabulary that's, it's one of these. That's another thing I hate about a lot of these left-wing people like Ta-Nehisi Coates, is that they use words that are, so to say, above their pay grade and above the pay grade of the audience to which they're writing. They're using words that they know are highfalutin. They know are how would we say, they're not in the right. They are. For instance, they'll use a very highbrow word in one sentence, and then they'll use a very crass vernacular word to express the same thing in the next sentence, and the whole thing doesn't stylistically make sense. That, I'd say, is the mark of an amateur writer, or a writer that's purely trying to showcase to showcase his or her vocabulary, extensive vocabulary. Jonah Goldberg is not like that at all. Jonah Goldberg, of course, has a tremendous vocabulary. I've learned quite a few words from this book, and but nevertheless, it is very easy to follow him, and he is a compulsively readable writer. Nearly every person that I've shown the introduction to this book, which is fantastic. If you can't read, if you don't feel like investing hours and hours of time reading this book, which I think you should, it's well worth the read. The introduction. Once you start reading the introduction, you will not be able to put it down. Reading one page of the introduction is like eating one potato chip. You cannot stop after eating it. You will have to go one after another. And several of the excerpts that I marked out here are from the introduction, because I think it gives a fantastic summary of the book as a whole. And I looked through the book and I couldn't find necessarily more succinct and relevant summaries of his ideas offhand. I will say that what I was about to say, I think, will make some more sense as we dive in. So let's begin. So, Suicide of the West. I have to say that Jonah Goldberg begins the book kind of, and it seems to be a provocative way in which he begins the book, and I'll just read it to you. There is no God in this book. The humans in this story are animals who evolved from other animals, who in turn evolved from ever more embarrassing animals, and before that from a humiliating sea of ooze, slime, meats, and vegetables in the primordial stew. We pulled ourselves out of the muck, not some Garden of Eden. Indeed, if the Garden of Eden never existed, it was a slum. We created the miracle of modernity all on our own, and if we lose it, that will be our fault too. This book assumes that the Almighty does not guide human affairs and does not intercede on our behalf. God is not in the picture. Well, he is in the picture in the sense that the idea of God and gods play a very large role in human affairs, but my assumption is that God is in our heads and hearts, not in the heavens above. The only concession to my own beliefs lies in the word assumes, just above. I am making this assumption for the purposes of an argument. I am not an atheist, but I think it is useful to play one for the argument I want to make, as a means of guiding the reader through a way of thinking about the world. In Enlightenment-based democracies, claims that something is true because God says so are inherently suspect, because part of the point of the Enlightenment was to create a space where people can disagree about what God wants from us, if he wants anything at all. That's why the highest form of argument in a democracy is one based on facts grounded in reason and decency. I won't deny I'm passionate in parts of this book, but I try not to let the passion get ahead of the facts or the argument. That is because I think persuasion matters. Though you wouldn't know it from the last few years in American life. On the right and left, persuading your opponents is out of faction, replaced by the mandate to rile up your supporters. I am weary of that, particularly on my own side. So I'm taking a gamble and doing this the old-fashioned way. So, listening to interviews that even people who are sympathetic to Jonah Goldberg, who are good friends with him, like Ben Shapiro, Andrew Klavan, those types of people, Bill Kristol, a point that several people have brought up, that they bring up this introduction, where the fact that he says there is no God in this book, and there are some people who have gotten just completely out of sorts about this, and accusing Jonah Goldberg of essentially the thing that he just explained. He's not an atheist, and he's not making a completely secular argument either. He's not divorcing Western thought from religion, in particular from Judaism and Christianity at all. He explains it. He gives it its proper place. Now, you could make an argument that Judaism and Christianity do play more of a role in the development of Western thinking than Jonah Goldberg gives in the book. That's fine, but I honestly think that, in a sense, that sort of argument would have to be made that he doesn't seem to care enough about it. Now, he does lay it out. I don't think anybody who's read the book again can contend that Jonah Goldberg does not lay this out, that religion plays an integral and a necessary, you could probably say necessary, role in the development of capitalism, the development of free markets, of individual rights, and the Lockean revolution, as he calls it. He says, of course, that religion has fought against that religion was an opposing force in the historical process, which brought about the miracle. But no, that's just the truth. You can't deny these things. You can't. You just because you want to favor one side, just because you want to favor the religious side over the secular side, so to say, in the modern cultural war, doesn't mean that you can't look at both sides of the both roles that religion has played in the development of capitalism and of modernity. So I just think that this is another instance of people having to have something to say about a book, about an incredible book, about a very highly relevant book, but they don't take the time to read the damn book. Instead, they just look at the first page and they say, "Oh, I don't like this. I don't like that it says that there is no God in this book." I think it's just so stupid that people would do this. And that's one of the things I want to make sure that we do with this podcast, is that we hear Jonah Goldberg out, we look at his arguments, and we analyze them. We may disagree with some of them. I think that his arguments, I'm hard-pressed to find anything wrong with most of his arguments because they're so cogently argued. He backs it up with he has an appendix, which is what I was going to get to earlier. He has an appendix at the back of the book, which is well worth reading. Now, I think he sells it short in the book. He says that if you just want further evidence that the world has gotten tremendously better, that progress has been astronomical in terms of poverty alleviation, in terms of access to technology and medical resources all over the world, especially in the developing world, and that it's due to the miracle, it's due to capitalism, it's due to the ideas of individual rights, of limited government that were born in Britain, given their utmost, their best and fullest expression in the American idea. They were written down in the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, and that these have resulted in widespread prosperity and increased liberty throughout the world. The appendix, as he sells it, or as he explains it earlier in the book, is merely an attachment of statistics, of copious statistics on all sorts of fronts to prove that this is true. I'd say that maybe he did this to reward people for reading the appendix, but he puts one of at the tail end of the appendix, he puts one of what I think was one of the greatest encapsulations of the major themes in the book, and so we'll read it. The free market system depends on values, ideas, and institutions outside the realm of economics to function, a topic I covered in the second half of this book. But for now, the important point is this. The free market system is not merely the best anti-poverty program ever conceived. It is quite literally the only anti-poverty system ever invented. Poverty is the natural human condition, and it remained the steady state of human affairs for nearly all of human history. Socialism, as a label, is a relatively recent invention, but socialism as an idea is beyond ancient. Socialism is the economics of the tribe. We evolved as a cooperative, resource-sharing species. This is one reason why the idea of socialism keeps coming back. It's in our brains, alongside myriad other factory preset ideas and desires, that capitalism is unnatural. Individual liberty and free speech are unnatural. Liberal democratic capitalism is at war with human nature in every generation. It is a common theme in literature. Every wish comes with a catch. From Goethe and Marlowe's Faust to Kipling's sing-song of Old Man Kangaroo to Hans Christian Andersen's Galoshes of Fortune, to a half-dozen episodes of The Twilight Zone, we must be careful what we wish for. The miracle of now is the answer to 1,000 generations of wishes by people whose lives were poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Capitalism is the greatest peaceful cooperative endeavor for human enrichment ever created, by orders of magnitude. The catch? It doesn't feel like it. It doesn't feel cooperative. It doesn't even feel peaceful. It is full of uncertainty and tumult. Capitalism cannot provide meaning, spirituality, or a sense of belonging. Those things are upstream of capitalism. And that's okay. Capitalism is an economic system that is fantastic at doing what we claim we want from economic systems: growth and prosperity. The problem is that what we say we want from an economic system and what we actually want are different things often. Economics is a sphere of the larger civilization, and we want more than what mere capitalism can provide. We want meaning. We want to feel like we're part of the tribe. But just as a hammer makes for a terrible knife, capitalism is a tool ill-suited for filling the holes in our souls. Meaning comes from family, friends, faith, community, and countless little platoons of civil society. When those institutions fail, capitalism alone cannot restore them. As a result, human nature starts making demands of the political and economic systems that neither can possibly fulfill. Liberty, economic and political, is recast as the source of our problems. Having lost faith in other realms, we lose faith in the miracle itself, and we cast about for what feels more natural: tribalism, nationalism, or socialism in one guise or another. And so, before I go on, I should probably do a concise summary of what Jonah Goldberg's overall point is. So he traces the history of humanity from the earliest beginnings in the introduction. We'll get to a nice quote that summarizes it, to about the year 1700, when what he calls the miracle happens. And the miracle is an explosion in terms of world history. From then on, the miracle is development of capitalism, of free markets, and of ideas, what he calls the Lockean Revolution, which are the ideas of limited government, of individual rights, that rights are God-given, they're not given by the state, and they can't be taken away by the state, that governments are instituted among men to protect their rights. And from this, he goes on to detail how capitalism and how the spread of Lockean ideas, especially through the medium of America, revolutionized the way the world was, and how life until then, to even contemplate it from our standpoint, it's even ridiculous for us to contemplate it, that the poorest among us have it much, much, much better than the richest did even 400 years, even 300 years ago, even when this process began. The living standards of people back then, they hardly exist except among, say, about 10% or so of the world population now lives in extreme poverty, and extreme poverty was the norm for the vast, vast, vast majority of human history. It's not even questionable. And then not only that, but it was the norm to have totalitarian governments. And then he goes into human nature, the discussion of human nature, that human nature itself is opposed, that these institutions are not natural. It is natural for us to be tribal. It is natural for us to trust our kin and to trust those that we consider in our tribe around us, and that it is very unnatural to treat strangers as, so to say, as people from whom both of you, people with whom you can interact in mutually beneficial transactions, such as you engage in the marketplace. That's a very unnatural, very recent idea, but that it's an idea that's produced untold untold alleviations from poverty, staggering increases in wealth around the world, and the overall sharing, enlarging of the pie beyond what it was before, which means that every individual's pieces, even though they're distributed unequally, everybody gets a bigger piece. And so this is one of the more interesting. This is one of the most interesting parts of the book, and this is where he describes he gives a I don't know if this isn't necessarily a metaphor, but it's a thought experiment to try to depict the staggering change, the almost the incomprehensible change that took place in beginning in 1700 until now in the course of human history. So he says, "My argument begins with some assertions. Capitalism is unnatural. Democracy is unnatural. Human rights are unnatural. The world we live in today is unnatural, and we stumbled into it more or less by accident. The natural state of mankind is grinding poverty punctuated by horrific violence terminating with an early death. It was like this for a very, very long time. Imagine you're an alien assigned with keeping tabs on Homo sapiens over the last 250,000 years. Every 10,000 years you check in. In your notebook, you'd record something like this. Visit 1. Semi-hairless, upright, nomadic apes foraging and fighting for food. Visit 2. Semi-hairless, upright bands of nomadic apes foraging and fighting for food. No change. Visit 3. Semi-hairless, upright bands of nomadic apes foraging and fighting for food. No change. Except for a few interesting details about their migrations and subsequent changes in diet, forms of rudimentary tools, and competition with Neanderthals, you'd write the same thing roughly 23 times over 230,000 years. On the 24th visit, you note some amazing changes. Basic agriculture and animal domestication have been discovered by many of the scattered human populations. Some are using metal for weapons and tools. Clay pottery has advanced considerably. Rudimentary mud and grass shelters dot some landscapes, introducing a new concept in human history, the home. But there are no roads, no stone buildings worthy of the label. Still a pretty impressive advance in such a short period of time, a mere 10,000 years. Eagerly returning 10,000 years later, our alien visitor's ship would doubtless get spotted by NORAD. He might even get here in time to see Janet Jackson play at the halftime show at the Super Bowl. In other words, nearly all of humanity's progress has taken place in the last 10,000 years. But this is misleading. It's like saying between Jeff Bezos, Mark Zuckerberg, and me, our combined net worth is more than $150 billion. Because for most of that 10,000 years, the bulk of humanity lived in squalor. Indeed, there are many who argue, plausibly, that the agricultural revolution made things worse for most of humanity. Our diet got less diverse, and for the vast majority of us, our days were now defined by tedious, backbreaking labor. The startling truth is that nearly all of human progress has taken place in the last 300 years, and for many of the billions of non-Westerners lifted out of crushing poverty thanks to capitalism, it's happened in the last 30 years. Around the year 1700, in a corner of the Eurasian landmass, humanity stumbled into a new way of organizing society and thinking about the world. It didn't seem obvious, but it was as if the great parade of humanity that had started walking through a portal to a different world. Following sociologist Robin Fox and historian Ernest Gellner, I call this different world the miracle. And we made it, even if we didn't really know what we were doing. Unique among species, Fox writes, we created the novel environment, and the super-novel environment that followed on the miracle by ourselves and for ourselves. And so that image of the alien coming back again and again every 10,000 years really gives you a perspective as to how recent in human history this has been. And then the fact that he zooms in on it's all happened in the past 300 years. And even then, for most of the world, it's been in the last 50 years or so that billions, literally billions of people have been lifted out of extreme poverty. Diseases have been cured. Billions of lives have been spared based on the medical advances that have occurred thanks to the miracle as a whole. The advance of science and reason, and the use of reason in politics, and the development of science. And yet, we in the West are, as Jonah Goldberg says a number of times, we are ungrateful for this. The ingratitude is really profound. The fact that, first of all, we don't realize that this is going on. The second is that we don't appreciate what it is that is causing, that has allowed us to achieve such glorious things, to have almost conquered poverty, to have conquered disease. That we don't appreciate it. First of all, because we don't often recognize it, and second, because as he gets to and develops, and we'll get into some excerpts that say this, our nature is at war with it. In particular, the romantic side of our nature, the romantic in terms of not romance, but in terms of romanticism, in terms of the as he puts it, the primacy, the tendency we have to impose a primacy of feelings in terms of our thinking about the world and thinking about society, thinking about philosophy. And so he talks about how capitalism, because it's unnatural, it is alienating. And this can also be reinforced by dislocations in the market, by people losing their jobs due to innovation, due to immigration, due to automation, and that this produces widespread hostility toward capitalism, even though overall the people who are exposed to these detrimental situations by virtue of capitalism, the benefits that they've received by the operation of the free market system, the downsides pale in comparison. But it's hard to see that, and capitalism does not seem like it is friendly, does not seem like it is the greatest boon to mankind that has ever been discovered. It seems like it's just death. It's just dead, soul-killing, soul-crushing competition all the time. It's like the Boston song, "People living in competition. All I want is to have my peace of mind." It's that's what he would call. He doesn't talk about that song, but he has a chapter where he shows how pop culture reinforces, American pop culture in particular, reinforces these ideas of romanticism, of our rebellion against the market system, against the miracle, and how this is part of the reason why ingratitude for the miracle is so strong today, because so many pop cultures, because rock and roll is inherently romantic, because so much of our pop music, our movies depict people who are alienated from because of capitalism or because of the tedium of the workplace. Office Space. I love the movie Office Space, but that's a very romantic movie. It shows somebody rebelling in this sort of impractical, inchoate way against the marketplace, against the sort of, say, the banal, meaningless market office. And even though it does make some valid points, that shouldn't be. You can't take movies like that to mean, you can't take those sorts of messages very seriously on a social level, because without capitalism we would have very, very few things of value. We would revert back to tribes. We would revert back to the savagery of the majority of human history. And so we'll read a bit for his elaboration of what the miracle exactly is. The idea that we should presume strangers are not only inherently trustworthy, but also have innate dignity and rights does not come naturally to us. We have to be taught that, carefully taught. The free market is even more unnatural because it doesn't just encourage us to see strangers to be tolerated, it encourages us to see strangers as customers. The invention of money was one of the greatest advances in human liberation in all of recorded history, because it lowers the barriers to beneficial human interaction. It reduces the natural tendency to acquire things from strangers through violence by offering the opportunity for commerce. A grocer may be bigoted toward Catholics, Jews, blacks, whites, gays, or some other group, but his self-interest encourages him to overlook such things. Likewise, the customer may not like the grocer, but the customer's self-interest encourages her to put such feelings aside if she wants to buy dinner. In a free market, money corrodes caste and class and lubricates social interaction. Violence, the natural way to get what you want from strangers, is zero-sum. I hit you with a rock and take your apple. There is one apple-eating winner, and there is one appleless loser with a lump on his head. Trade is mutually beneficial, because the apple buyer needs an apple, and the apple seller needs the buyer's money for something else. Trade builds trust, and encourages strangers to see each other as equals in a transaction. Labor and commerce in a market order create objective metrics to judge people by. I don't care if so is black, Jewish, gay, Catholic. He does a good job and shows up on time. Liberalism, by enforcing the rule of law and recognizing the rights of everybody, especially property rights, makes trade easier and trade makes liberalism more desirable. And by liberalism, that's a sort of a catch-all term for the ideas of the miracle. Sorry, kind of getting a hold of where I have my excerpts. That's a catch-all. It's like classical liberalism is what he means. It's the ideas of the Lockean revolution, of the scientific revolution. And but the problem that Jonah Goldberg traces in so many areas is that we do not appreciate that this is because the marketplace does not fill the longing that we need, that we have for belonging, which goes back to our days in tribes. Uh, Civil society, what he describes in the language of Burke as little platoons. Civil society, for the longest time in in American history, filled that role. That the voluntary associations that we make, the institutions that we join, like churches, synagogues, bowling leagues, even sports teams, even workplaces can serve as civil society. That these sort of voluntary associations and institutions, these were the things that stood between, that insulated the individual in a sphere of liberty, in a sphere of meaning, and outside of the state, outside of the coercive nature of the state, of the government. And more, because of the expansion of the government, which he details in chapters where he covers the growth of the administrative state, of this insidious bureaucratic structure that is self-regulating, which is to mean it's not regulated, that it's very on very dubitable, very shaky constitutional grounds, and that it poses a bigger threat, perhaps, to individual liberty than any other facet of the government, than any other facet of the current of state. And but beside that, he talks about how more and more, as civil society has died due to a number of factors, including the expansion of the state, but also he posits in later chapters, due to the diversity of our society, the ethnic diversity of our society, and our failure to assimilate, to insist that groups that migrate to our country assimilate to our values and celebrate American values. That this overall has resulted in a decrease in trust. That is something that he talks about later. That it has been the sociological studies have shown that diverse studies, or that diverse populations have much lower levels of trust and social capital than societies that are homogenous, like the Nordic states are very homogenous, and that's why all these socialists looking to Norway and Sweden, all these other countries, as though they're models, and that their type of socialism can be imposed here. They're naive, because those types of societies are almost exclusively Nordic, or they're Norwegian, they're Swedish, whatever. They're exclusively white, almost, except for the Muslims, that are the Muslim populations that are more and more migrating there. But anyway, he describes how civil society is eroding, and the way that he describes civil society gives a beautiful metaphor for it, which I think he gives credit to someone else for formulating it, but I'll read it anyway because it's just so beautiful. So, find this. I've always thought of civil society to be like a great reef in the ocean. The coral provides a rich ecosystem in which a vast variety of life resides, which is why they are sometimes called the rainforests of the sea. They constitute less than 0.1% of the worldwide ocean surface, but account for a staggering 25% of all marine species. For most of prehistory, there was really only one institution, the tribe or band. It may have been subdivided into some smaller units, the family, the hunters versus the gatherers, etc., but they were all subsumed into the tribe itself. After the agricultural revolution, the division of labor created space for more institutions, some of which could even be in conflict with one another. There was space outside the state, and in that space, institutions grew over time at choral pace. Their ecosystem changed little, and when it did so very slowly, allowing humans to adapt. The reef was made up only of a few distinct colonies of coral: the family, the local community, the church, a relative handful of occupations, usually supervised by guilds of one sort or another, and of course the state, including the military. Then, for reasons discussed at length earlier, there was the miraculous explosion of institutions, and with that explosion came a staggering burst of human prosperity and creative genius, which only expanded and extended the whole process. Creating a nurturing environment for mediating institutions is a form of social engineering, arguably the greatest feat of social engineering in human history, but not in the way we normally define the term. It is social engineering of the sort I described when discussing the differences between English gardens and gardens in France. English gardens create a zone of liberty where people and institutions are free to prosper. Humans serve as pollinators, moving from one institution to another, gaining sustenance and providing it at the same time. It is another social engineering without any. It is social engineering without any intended goal other than the flourishing of the garden itself. And then If you can forgive the whiplash of going back and forth between metaphors, civil society in the modern era is akin to creating artificial reefs. Drop a pile of concrete or sink sink an oil rig to the bottom of the Gulf of Mexico and wait. Soon coral, algae, barnacles, oysters, and other creatures attach themselves to it. As they accumulate, fish take up residence in the new shelter. Oil rigs in Southern California host up to 27 times more fish than natural rocky reefs in the same area. I hate the expression, if you build it, they will come, but in this case it's apt, and when they do come, they flourish. The hitch to this metaphor is that the state cannot build the reefs, it can only protect them. If you've ever been scuba diving or snorkeling, you know that swimmers aren't supposed to touch the coral with their bare hands. We have oils in our skin that disrupt the membranes of coral and can even kill a whole colony. The state is a greasy-handed tourist in civil society, except when it is extremely careful, which usually it is not. When it intervenes in institutions, it harms them and often kills them. And then later he says, the government is usually here to help. The government does many good and important things, but what it cannot do is love you. And that's one of the main points that he makes, is that government cannot substitute for the decline in the voluntary associations and the meaning that they used to give. And so he talks about how the romantic spirit inside of humanity is one of the things of he brings in this concept of corruption, and not corruption merely in the sense of political corruption, of graft, of influence peddling, for instance, but in terms of decay. That this metaphor, this word corruption, used to take on a wide gamut of little nuances, of little pieces of meaning, so to say, where it also meant bodily decay. It meant the natural way of things. That for instance, and he gives this image later, that when you set a car in a field, and you just let a brand new car, you just sit there and you come back a year later and you just see that it's all that there's rust, that there are creatures in it that are making it its home. There are birds and everything. There are weeds growing up all around it, and eventually he says, come back in 100 years, it might not. You barely just see a husk of it. 1,000 years, it probably won't even be there anymore. Nature reclaims what is hers, and this applies just as much to institutions, to human institutions, as it does to physical objects in nature. That human nature, our tribal instincts, our romantic desires, or the romantic side of our personalities, are nature's way of trying to reclaim the social, the unnatural social structures and institutions that we have developed and that have produced the marvelous benefits that have accrued since 1700. And so this is how he describes romanticism. Nailing down the meaning, history, and forms of Romanticism, as we will see, is a tricky business, but I agree with scholars who argue that Romanticism begins with the philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau. The core of Romanticism for Rousseau and those who followed him is the primacy of feelings, specifically the feeling that the world we live in is not right, that it is unsatisfying and devoid of authenticity and meaning, or simply requires too much of us, and there must be an easier way. Secondarily, because our feelings tell us that the world is out of balance, rigged, artificial, unfair, or most often, oppressive and exploitative, our natural wiring drives us to the belief that someone must be responsible. The evil string pullers take on different forms depending on the flavor of tribalism, but the most common include the Jews, which Goldberg himself is a Jew, the capitalists, and these days on the right, the globalists and cultural Marxists. And so this discussion of Romanticism, and the thing is that you can't condemn Romanticism any more than you can condemn your right foot. That Romanticism is an intrinsic part of what it means to be of human experience, and so in grappling with, but you have to grapple with the implications of Romanticism and the ways that you check it using reason and using logical forms of thinking and argument. And in particular in gratitude, in maintaining gratitude and in preserving the values of the founding, of the miracle, and passing those on to future generations. That is the injunction that Goldberg has for his readers, is that it is our job, especially if we're parents, to inculcate the values of the founding, the virtues of that sustain the founding ideals that are necessary to sustain limited government, are necessary to sustain civic engagement, and that's one of the things that he says, is that unfortunately he goes into how even though they're brilliant students nowadays that are at our universities, they're not learning about the great cultural inheritance of the West. They don't know. They've never read any of the great books of history or of literature. They've never read the Iliad and Odyssey. They know about them. They don't. And this is my personal experience. I know this is one of the few people who has tried to read these books, that hardly anybody else actually even tries to read them. They just need to know about it. They just want to know enough as they need to know about enough to pass the test, and that's all. They'll instantly forget about it as soon as they learn, as soon as they take that stupid test. And that I guess I was going on about romanticism. That romanticism is an important facet of human nature, but partly because it's so hard, it's so ingrained in us because it has tribal origins in us, and that we need to keep it in check. That's one of the things that, even though we have to explore it, it's impossible that we not have flights of romanticism. And one thing that's interesting about how he talks about romanticism, or about the romantic responses to the alienation of the marketplace, is that he legitimizes them a lot. That he I can't even imagine the number of times he says the word understandable in the latter part of the book, where he talks about the first part of the book is very positive. It's detailing the great advancements that have occurred in human history, and then the latter part of the book is about the actual suicide of the West, the decline, and he uses that word very with intention. Suicide is entirely voluntary. It's not decline of the West, which you could argue could be due to involuntary, or due to intractable, irreversible factors of irresistible flow of history, so to say. Decline is a choice, as he says. That's one of the last things he says in the book. That's one of the last lines he says, is that decline is a choice, and the actions that we are engaging in right now to sort of say to kill ourselves, they're entirely voluntary, and we can stop them. One of the ideas that he repeats over and over again is that the miracle was born of rhetoric. The miracle was born because we changed the way that we think and the way that we talk about economics, about trade, about rights, about government, and what can be created by words can be destroyed by words if they're changed. And so he draws on the economic historian Deirdre McCloskey a lot in this book. And so, as she says here, the economy is nothing without the words supporting it. The way people talked and thought about how the world worked changed. That's Goldberg's quote. And just because we're going a lot over time, although that's just proof of how deep, how rich this book is, and why I think even this summary that I'm giving you, there's no way that it can suffice to give you everything that's in this book. It's, even though I'm giving you the major points, there's a lot that you're missing, and Goldberg is a fantastic writer. He brings in all sorts of examples. He brings in all sorts of examples from history, all sorts of examples from literature and pop culture, which is a very interesting chapter. Jonah Goldberg is very, very well versed in pop culture, and I think that this has to be the best book that has been published this year. I think I'm about to read Roger Scruton's book Conservatism, so maybe that one will top it. I don't see how it could. It's a lot less ambitious than this book is, but we'll see, and I'll probably review it for this podcast. So next quote I wanted to read was an explanation of why identity politics, which is a facet of romanticism, is one of the things that's corrupting the miracle, in his words. We were once taught that when America deviated from the ideal, which he explains earlier, as the ideals of racial blindness, of meritocracy. It was a shameful betrayal of our best selves. When, for instance, the Supreme Court upheld the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1889, it agreed with the government that the Chinese remained strangers in the land, residing apart by themselves, and that they were unlikely to assimilate with our own people or to make any change in their habits. I was always taught this was a dark moment in American history. To be sure, American students are still taught that. We still believe that the government shouldn't exclude some groups based on arbitrary prejudices, but the rest of the melting pot formula is breaking down in three ways. First, we are not taught that the government should give special preferences to some groups. Second, as a cultural imperative, we are increasingly told that we should judge people based upon the group they belong to. Assimilation is now considered a dirty word, and at last we are taught that there is no escaping from our group identity. Multiculturalism and identity politics ideologies contain within them myriad contradictions and inconsistencies, but as a broad generalization, it is impossible to deny that our culture is shot through with an obsession with race, gender, and ethnic essentialism. At a very young age, our children are being encouraged to talk about their individual identities even before they have them, writes the political theorist Mark Lilla. By the time they reach college, many assume that diversity discourse exhausts political discourse, and have shockingly little to say about such perennial questions as class, war, the economy, and the common good. And so that's another way. This is an example of what he's talking of this book as a whole. It's a very nonpartisan book. He takes, of course, when he gets into Trump, he really attacks people on his side when he gets to talk about Trump. That this is not a partisan book, even though he is, of course, a conservative and a Republican. He does not. He tries to keep the partisanship at bay. He wants, and that's again why he went to this atheism point, to the there is no God in this book point, is that he wants this book to serve as a bridge to cast away different assumptions that we might have, that we might expect him to bring to the book, of theism, of conservative ideology, and put those aside for the moment so that we can make broader arguments, so that we can get broader support for the ideas of conserving the miracle, of conserving the founding ideas and principles. And so, just briefly, I'd like to get into his discussion of Trump. I thought that this paragraph is probably the most interesting and compelling description of Trump, of different aspects of Trump's character that I've seen in print. Were Trump able to check his id and think beyond the horizon of his instincts in the moment, he would be a far more formidable demagogue. Fortunately, he cannot, and so the constitutional architecture of our government, combined with the patriotic commitments of most of the people who work for him, is more than adequate to constrain his will to power as president. Still, it is precisely these qualities in him that make him so fascinating. Beneath his suits and his abnormally long ties, he is a throwback, a kind of generic prototype of pre-modern man, obsessed with being the alpha of the group. Because he is bereft of any coherent ideology and largely immune to any of the norms of good character, Donald Trump is in many respects a perfect example of how capitalism, absent the extra-rational dogmas of morality, creates creatures of pure appetite, guided only by the most rudimentary software of human nature. He cares about sex and power, dominating others and having his status affirmed. He puts family above all other considerations, but defines the family's interests in terms of wealth and dynastic glory. He views others as instruments of his will, whose value is measured in their loyalty to him, a loyalty that is rarely reciprocated. When asked what sacrifices he made comparable to those of parents who lost a child in war, he couldn't even name any sacrifice at all. He is a knight, in the Nietzschean sense, and he makes his own morality. And so he goes into the reason he brings up Trump is because he thinks that he's a prime manifestation of the romantic rebellion against the miracle. That Trump, even though of course he has co-opted the conservative movement, you could say, to turn it to his own political advantage, or to ride it to political power, that Trump's insistence on protectionism, on as he calls it, economic nationalism, and on his fierce cultural battles with the left, and his defiance of which you could take it as a fight against people who are denigrating the miracle, but besides that, to put that aside, and his general lack of regard for ideology, or his general lack of regard for any sort of coherent character, that these are things that appeal to the tribal side of particularly of Republicans, the desire for a strong man, the desire for a tribal chief who will conquer the enemies, who will conquer the opposing tribe. And so I think that his worries about Trump, while they may be I think they're a bit overstated. I think that Trump is not necessarily that much of a danger to. In fact, I think that a lot of what he's doing then again, who knows? None of us know how this is going to turn out, and none of us even know if he's going to stay for at this point 2 more years, or for 6 more years. And so, while he is doing a lot that is perhaps going to be deleterious and to the cause of liberty, to the cause of small government or limited government, none of us can know whether the things that he's doing, which seem to be positive, especially his impact on the Supreme Court, may not indeed salvage a lot or make things a lot better than they would have been, say, especially under a Hillary Clinton presidency. And so, before I leave, I would like to read a passage that really refutes a lot of the sort of the simplistic nonsense that's been said about this book, talking about how he doesn't give God his due, and how he gives short shrift to religion, and how it's contributed to the miracle. I just wanted to read this really quickly. So this is from the conclusion. And if people had read the conclusion and not just the introduction, maybe they would have gotten this. I have tried to keep God out of this book, but as a sociological entity, God can't be removed from it. Again, he sort of said that at the beginning, which makes it even more ridiculous. I start the story of the miracle in the 1700s, but that is because that is where prosperity started to take off like a rocket. But a rocket doesn't materialize from thin air on a launch pad. The liftoff is actually the climax of a very long story. Simply put, we got where we are because of God. I don't mean this as an argument for providence or divine intervention. I believe in God, but if you don't, you cannot discount the importance of God as a human innovation. I don't mean gods, plural, but God as a single omniscient being looking at us in all our private moments. Prior to the God of the Jews, gods were more like prickly servants than masters. Humans picked their deities to support their passions, to grant their wishes, to justify their conquests. The Romans, Greeks, Hindus, Vikings, ancient Chinese, Japanese, and others created gods to match their feelings, from hate and anger to lust and compassion. The Hebrew God reversed this division of labor, demanding that the people work for him, not the other way around. And then he talks about how the golden rule, do unto others as you would have them do unto you, is the seed from which grew the concept of the individual. Christianity, in other words, introduced the idea that we are born into a state of natural equality. For the Romans and Greeks, aristocracy was natural, and some men were simply by nature slaves. Of course, even after Christianity conquered Europe, the natural tendency of elites to lock in their advantages endured. Christianity's emphasis on human dignity and equality did not destroy monarchy, aristocracy, serfdom, or slavery for more than 16 centuries, but the fuse, one could argue, was lit. And then later he says, there was one thing that informed all of these passions and ideas, the idea that God was watching. The greatest check on the natural human desire to give in to your feelings and do what feels good, or even what feels right, quote unquote, can be captured in a single phrase: God-fearing. And so enough about this enough of this nonsense where that Jonah Goldberg is suddenly an atheist, even though he's been a powerful Jewish voice on the right for decades now. I think that I marked out one more quote, but I'm not sure if it's necessary to read it. Okay, yeah, we'll read one more quote. More than faith and belief, more than reason and data, the indispensable ingredient for the work of preserving the miracle to be successful is gratitude. Webster's dictionary defines ingratitude as forgetfulness of, or poor return for, kindness received. The key word is forgetfulness. Gratitude is impossible without memory. How can we repay a kindness we do not remember? But forgetfulness has a special meaning here. It is not merely a lapse of memory. Remember is an active verb. In the Bible, it is an action, not a passive function of the brain. Remember the Sabbath day, to keep it holy, is an instruction to do something attentively and mindfully. When we fail to remember to keep these principles alive in our hearts and to remind ourselves why we should give thanks for them, we grow ungrateful for them. There are no permanent victories. The only victory worth fighting for, because it is the only victory that is achievable, is to hand off this civilization to the next generation and to equip that generation to carry on the fight and so on forever. We cannot get rid of human nature and humanity's natural tribal tendencies, but we know that under the right circumstances, our tribal nature can be grafted to a commitment to liberty, individualism, property rights, innovation, etc. It happened in England, accidentally but organically. It happened in America by choice. America talked itself into existence. The founders argued the Constitution out of the ether, and they believed it could work so long as people of good character fended off the inevitable entropy of human nature. They wrote it down and made it hard to change it to help us in that effort. The only thing that gives the Constitution real lasting power is our commitment to it, and there's nothing preventing us from walking away from it other than our refusal to do so. And the last line of the book is, decline is a choice. Principles, like gods, die when no one believes in them anymore. And so this is a fantastic book. I cannot recommend it highly enough. It took me, I can't believe it took me this long to read it. I began reading it as soon as I got home from college 8 weeks ago to the day, May 5th. And it's been a blast the entire way. And my failure to read it any quicker is a reflection more on me and on my scatterbrainedness, if that's a word, in reading. And so this is a book that deserves to be on the top of all the bestseller lists, but because people don't want to read it. And let me just give you one last jab. Trevor Noah, if you ever see this, you're a crappy interviewer. You were one of the worst interviewers I've ever seen in the world. When you interviewed Jonah Goldberg for this book, it is clear that you only read the back flap and were repeating just a couple phrases that you picked up right before you did the interview. And so I know Trevor Noah's not going to watch this, but that's just, again, more and more, this is why I'm doing this podcast. And I know this was obnoxiously long, but this book is full of rich insights and all sorts of relevant information. And so for people to give it this slight treatment where they think that Jonah Goldberg, that this book isn't worth their time to read, and so that they're just going to say the most superficial, stupid thing. They're going to focus on one line, there is no God in this book, and they're going to make it into a molehill, even though in the course of the book it's not really that important of it. It's far from the most important thing that he says in the book. And the fact that people would pretend to know, pretend to wield with authority the knowledge that's in this book, to be able to pronounce upon it, to give an ignorant opinion upon it when they haven't even read the stupid thing. It just really, really offends me to the core, even though, of course I didn't write this, but it really offends me that people would have this arrogance, have this presumption, have this this necessity to say things, this necessity to give an opinion when it's not due, to give an opinion when you're not a qualified authority on the subject, which if you haven't read a book, or at least a majority of it, or understand what it's about, you are not a qualified authority, and you should not be giving an opinion about it. I don't care who you are. And if you're a prominent voice in the media, all the same. You shouldn't be pronouncing on things that you don't know about, especially things that could potentially, if you give a bad review of a book, it can hurt the author. It can dissuade people from reading a fantastic book, and this is a fantastic book. And that's part of the reason why this went so long, is I want to show that a lot of the stuff that people are saying about it is nonsense. This is one of the best books that I have read, period, ever in my life, and I think it's probably the best book that has been written this year. So thank you for joining me. I apologize if this episode was a little long, but I hope it was enjoyable, and we'll see you next time.